You're so well behaved so early. So anyway, welcome everybody to my class, the atomic bomb and the end of World War II. First things first, if you have not signed in, please do so on your way out. I would greatly appreciate that. Secondly, please turn off your cell phones. Please. Also like to take a moment to say hello to everybody there on Zoom across the great state of Alabama. And of course, I have a couple of my students in Chicago, so welcome to them as well. So we have this class, the atomic bomb and the end of World War II. And initially, I was not going to teach this class. And when I had finished last year's class, Asia Pacific War, some people had asked me if I would teach this class, and I said, I really had something totally different in mind, which hopefully I'll do in the future. And then last summer, there were two blockbuster movies that came out. And one of those movies was, of course, Oppenheimer. And some other people had reached out to me and said, hey, this might be a really great opportunity to do this class. And I said, okay, well, that makes sense. What the heck? It's been almost 5 years since I did this class last time, and it seemed like a reasonable amount of time. And of course, we have the tie-in with the movie, and it ties in with Asia Pacific War. And the really good thing for me, though, was that nobody asked me to do a history of the Barbie doll. So, because I'm really not qualified. So that brings us here today. So what is this class about? And it's, of course, about a very controversial topic today. And when I look at this class, I try to do this class as very best I can to put it in perspective of how people thought at that time. So, of course, things change. I mean, everybody knows that hindsight is 2020. You've all heard that phrase. And even at the time, there was some controversy about dropping the bomb. Some of the people at Los Alamos suggested, of course, that we should just use a demonstration. That we should just show the Japanese that we have this capability, and then that would perhaps they would surrender. A very common thinking at the time, and even today, really, particularly in the United States, is that by dropping the bomb, we ended the war quickly and we did not have to invade Japan, and this saved a ton of U.S. casualties, which is somewhat true. Other thinking is that as time has gone on, that it was totally morally incorrect to drop the bomb, and we dropped the bomb because of racism, that we didn't like the Japanese, particularly after Pearl Harbor, and we dropped the bomb for that reason. Another key piece that you'll hear over and over again is that we dropped the bomb because we wanted to show Russia how tough we were and prevent them in doing what they had done in Poland and Asia. So that's another reason. And then one that's really come about even more so lately, I think, and well, not lately, but since the 80s, is that Japan was just about to surrender, and we basically dropped the bomb anyway. So that they would have surrendered. They were going to surrender, and we just did that. So that's all topics that I will talk about as this class goes along. So a few things. I think it's really important, and if we're going to try to put this in perspective of how people thought at that time, we need to put this in perspective. How do I do that? And we need to go way back in history and start to look at how Japanese culture developed. So that's going to be the first class, basically, and it'll come up in the next several. And so it's going to be a little slow till we get to the bomb, I guess is what I'm telling you. So we'll get to the bomb, but that will not be right away. So with all that said, let's start the first class, which is Japan's emergence as a world power and political confrontation with the West. So we're going to go way back in history, and we're going to talk about the position of the emperor. Now, the position of the emperor becomes very rooted in Japanese culture by 1940. Very rooted. And partially because It's a combination of Japanese mythology and a combination of the state religion, which is Shintoism. So Shinto is the state religion, which is definitely tied into the position of the emperor, because of course, the emperor is considered to be part of the gods. He is part of the kami. So the earliest written piece about this is actually called the Kojiki, and the Kojiki is from 711, 712 Common Era. And what this really comes about is previous to this, all the work about empires and other royal families, there are other royal families, not just the imperial family in Japan. They, like the Chinese, wanted a written history to show their lineage, how they've come down through time. And they commissioned the Kojiki, and they also, shortly after that, I believe 720, they commissioned a thing called the Nikon Shoki, which is a little bit more detailed in some regards. So there's these two pieces. So if the emperor, because of these, is claimed to be the longest dynasty in history, 2,684 years of continuous lineage as of 2024. That's a really long time. And Japan also, very critical, had never been conquered previous to 1945. So what had happened, Kublai Khan had launched two invasions, one in 1274 and another in 1281. Both of those invasions were destroyed by giant storms. And the Japanese viewed this as a religious event, that the gods had intervened on their behalf, and that became what we know as kamikaze. So kami is the word for gods. Kazi is the word for wind. So you can interpret that as God's wind, or probably better in English, divine wind. So that's where the term kamikaze will come from. Well, the first emperor is named Jimmu. And he is believed to be a direct descendant of this lady right here, Amaterasu. So Amaterasu is the sun goddess, and she has a grandson. His name is Ninigi, and Ninigi begets Jimmu. So Jimmu is a direct descendant of the gods. He's partially human and partially divine. Critical to understand how they view that. Well, Japan believes that the kami had created the earth, and then when they created Earth, the first people that they created were the Japanese, or the Yamato people. So they are not only just the progenitors of the world, but at one point they actually ruled the world, because they were the first people. It makes sense if you think about it. They're the first ones there in their belief. So that is why they have very, very strong feelings about where their position is in the world, because of their religion, the Shintoism being indeed a state religion. Well, Amaterasu, what's her position? How does she fit into all this? And simply this: she is the sun goddess, and she is frightened by her brother, and she runs into a cave. When she runs into the cave, of course, there is no sunlight on the planet. Earth is now in darkness. And the other kami, they're not particularly happy with her brother, and they want the sun to shine back on the earth. So what they're going to do is they're going to attempt to lure her out of this cave using a jewel and a mirror. And they are successful. She comes out of the cave and the sun shines on the planet again. Her brother, as a way to apologize, will present her with a sword. So now we have a jewel, a mirror, and a sword, and these are the three imperial regalia of the Japanese. You can kind of look at these as if they were the crown jewels, but they have vastly more religious significance. Now, what will happen is occasionally they will bring these out. But they're always, well, like say when they have a new emperor, for example, they'll bring out some of the regalia, but you never actually see it because it's always in cases. So no one that I'm aware of in modern history has ever seen the regalia except for the emperor and perhaps their retainers. So real key, at the end of the war, you will see that the emperor definitely wants to make sure he can preserve this regalia because these are the symbols, the keys to his reign. You can't really be emperor without controlling these gifts from the gods. Well, we see here is that Jimmu is always portrayed as a warrior. He's holding a longbow. And it's thought that Jimmu had, in effect, conquered Japan. And the idea of that was he was going to bring his benevolent rule over the 8 corners of the world, or Hako Ichiu. Now, the 8 corners of the world, we see the world as the 4 corners in 2 dimensions. The Japanese see the world as 8 corners in 3 dimensions. So, little piece there with Hako Ichiu, he is going to give this benevolent rule to the entire planet. This will become, by 1940, actually a policy of the Japanese government. And that will be there'll be a speech given by the person at that time is Prime Minister Konoe. And Konoe actually is a prince, not the imperial family, but a prince of another royal family of Japan. And we'll talk about Konoe frequently in the early sessions of this class. So what's going to happen is that this is a policy. So you see how this is permeating into Japanese thinking leading into World War II. But previous to that, frequently in Japanese history, the emperor is not anything but a religious figure. He's not part of the government. He is just there to perform religious ceremonies. And that is going to be something that's going to change shortly. Well, let's jump ahead a couple thousand years and let's get to what's known as the Tokugawa shogunate. And shogun means great general. So what this is this is going to be a military government that's created after the critical battle for Japanese history, which I'm not sure anybody has ever heard of here, but it's called Sekigahara. And this is a major battle between the Tokugawa clan and other clans. And the Tokugawas have been trading with the Dutch. And they have been given or purchased firearms, primarily the arquebus, which is a very primitive form of basically of a rifle. And they're going to use these new weapons against these other clans, and they're going to have a very, very large victory. Well, it's going to be a feudal society. You will have the lords at the top. You will have the samurai, which we can see pretty much as a class of knights. And of course, then there'll be a merchant class, and at the bottom, there's going to be a peasant class. And at this time, there's going to be no political power whatsoever for the emperor. He is strictly just a religious figure. Now, 3 of the clans that were defeated, the Mori, they're stripped of their fief and basically shipped off to a different domain in Chosu. The Shimazu, they are in Satsuma, they're stripped. And the Chosokabe, they are stripped of their powers as well. So all 3 of these major groups are no longer running Japan. And they basically have been downtrodden. This is going to come back to haunt the Tokugawa significantly in 250 years later. Tokugawa shogunate decides what they're going to do is they're going to do the Sakoku, or the closed country. So they are going to completely isolate Japan. So they can really control this much easier. There's going to be no outside influence. And also this is thought to be, by some, designed as something that's anti-Christian, anti-Catholic in particular. And my personal feelings are is that's not necessarily the major reason. It's certainly part of it, but I think it was more to consolidate power and for them to gain a great amount of wealth because they are the only people that control imports and exports. So they have a major factor there of controlling the economy of the country. It's all in their power. And they go about disarming everyone. So firearms are completely banned except for their firearms. They destroy numerous amounts of swords. Japanese citizens are completely banned from leaving the country. You can't leave the country. If you do leave the country and come back, you're subject to punishment. Now, that does not mean that they don't have diplomatic missions, particularly in places like China and Korea. They do. But generally, no regular citizen of Japan can leave the country. Christians, of course, are persecuted, much like we would see the Inquisition in Europe, like against Jews and heretics. They're aggressively pursued. And I think one thing that's really unusual is that, let's say I'm a shipwrecked sailor and, my ship's sunk and I managed to fight my way ashore and this is great. Hey, I'm surviving. Well, then I go to prison. So nobody's allowed in this country at all. It's very, very closed society. Well, modern day environmentalists tend to think that this wasn't such a bad idea, that the Japanese at this time had learned to maintain their environment without a lot of damage to the environment. So, for example, if I wanted to cut down a tree, I needed to have permission. And that leads to the Japanese always having a source of building materials and fuel by vastly limiting how many trees you could cut down. Another key piece, of course, is they have to live within their means. They're not getting a lot of imports. So the Japanese begin to learn how to use things over and over and over again and make the best of their resources. So that's another key piece for the Japanese here. So they kind of looked at this wasn't so bad, but it has some problems as we're going to see. So we look at the picture, you can see the Jima, that is the only foreign port allowed for the Dutch and the Chinese to enter Japan. And that is in the city of Nagasaki. And Dejima is actually quite interesting. It was a peninsula, and the Japanese dug a trench basically to turn it into an island. It's very small. It's only 2.2 acres. And this is the only port of entry you're allowed in for the Dutch and for the Chinese. No one else can come in. No one else can go out either, because you have to have a written pass to get off the island, and you have to have a written pass to get on the island. So it's very, very strictly regulated. Well, there are some other ports. One port is for the Ainu. The Ainu are basically live on the northern Japanese island of Hokkaido. They also live on Sakhalin Island, and they have some people that live in Siberia. And the Japanese sort of look at the Ainu as if they were like we would look at American Indians at this time. They're relatively primitive, but they're willing to trade with them. They also have a port that's specifically designed just to trade with Koreans. And they have another port that's specifically trade for the Ryukyus. And the Ryukyus are where Okinawa is, for example. So just so we have an idea of that. So these are the four gateways. Everything is limited. You can't get into this country easily at all, okay? And what this is going to cause is there's going to be absolutely no industrial revolution by the mid-19th century. So the industrial revolution never happens to Japan at this point. And in fact, Japan is basically living in a completely feudal society until this guy shows up, Commodore Perry. And now that is the fine figure of a man. Yes, sir. Well, we learned about Commodore, at least I did, learned about Commodore Perry in grade school. And Commodore Perry was thought to be, he opened up Japan and he rescued sailors that were imprisoned, and he was relatively a good guy. And Well, there are a few more issues with Commodore Perry than that. For example, Commodore Perry was an alcoholic. He had cirrhosis of the liver. He was a very aggressive person, and he's a bit. The image I had of him as a grade schooler is really not particularly accurate. One thing about Commodore Perry, though, is he's considered to be the father of the United States steam-powered Navy. Now, so he's really, for his era, on the cutting edge of the Industrial Revolution as far as military goes. So he's, pretty much right there with creating the newer, more powerful Industrial Revolution U.S. Navy. Well, he's given a task, and that task is to go to Japan and open it up to trade. And there's another key piece to this, though. The key piece is that coal-powered ships have a very short range. And what we need places for our ships to stop and get coal on their way to trade primarily with China. What hasn't happened yet is we haven't had the Spanish-American War. So we don't have control of the Philippines. We don't have control of islands like Guam. We have very few places across the Pacific where we can actually stop and get coal. And you see a similar thing in World War II. The same idea of being able to slowly advance across the Pacific is based on not coal by World War II, but by tactical air power. So what we need to do is, in order to advance through the Central Pacific, we need to continue to capture islands, build an air base, and then use that air power to get to the next island, so on, until we get close to Japan. But it's the same kind of idea in the 1850s. Well, so Perry leads a squadron of, I would say, very technologically advanced ships for 1850s. These ships are coal-powered, they are steam-powered, and they also contain very modern, for their time, French-designed large cannon. These cannon don't fire just cannonballs, they are designed to fire shells, explosive shells. So very advanced for its era, and he's taking most of these ships in his fleet are indeed steamships. And he's going to go to Japan, and he's going to deliver a letter from the President of the United States. And the President of the United States in this letter says, hey, Japan, we really want to trade with you guys. We'd really like to stop off occasionally and pick up some coal. And, this is going to be really beneficial for everybody. The letter is addressed to the Emperor of Japan. Well, at this time, the Emperor of Japan has no political power, so it's totally should have not sent the letter to the Emperor, but that's what they do. And so Perry sails off, and he first stops in Okinawa. And he stops at Okinawa, and he sees the king of Okinawa, and he says to them, hey, we'd really like to trade with you guys. We'd like to stop by and pick up some coal. And the king of Okinawa says, we're not really very interested in this. And what Perry then does is he lands 200 well-armed U.S. Marines, and basically the Okinawans cave in. He then sails to Edo Bay, which today we would know as Tokyo Bay. Edo was the name of the capital at that time. And he sails in, he tries to present his letter, and the Japanese basically say, go away. We don't want anything to do with you guys. Just get out of here, right? Perry's like, well, that's really disappointing because, now I'm going to probably have to destroy you. And what he does is he says, well, it's 4th of July. And you know what? In America, we really like to celebrate 4th of July. So what he does is he fires 73 blank cannon rounds at the city of Edo. And hey, happy 4th of July, Japanese. Well, they're very intimidated by this, of course. And they finally agree to U.S. terms. They realize that they have no way to deal with U.S. technology, that they're going to be destroyed, in fact, if they don't back this up. Now, what's going to happen, of course, then is other powers are going to want the same thing, and those will be Britain, Russia, and France. So they demand equal rights to go to Japan and trade and get coal. And the Japanese really have nothing they can do about this. Now, I really like, and there will be numerous efforts of pictures like this. And this is a contemporary Japanese wood, I guess, I'm not sure, of Perry's black ships. So this is a depiction of what the Japanese thought his ships looked like. And you can see it's a paddle wheel steamer. It's belching smoke. And it's firing its cannon, which looked like a laser beam coming out of the side of that ship. And I'm sure to the Japanese at that time, it was equivalent to what we would think of as a laser beam, because that's really more power than they have to deal. They can't deal with this technology. So they are in a lot of trouble because they don't want to be involved with the West, but now they're being basically forced to. Well, that's going to lead us to the Meiji Restoration. And of course, who's going to get blamed for this is going to be the Tokugawas, because the Tokugawas have left Japan unable to defend itself. And a phrase starts going around Japan, and it says, "Revere the emperor, expel the barbarians." Well, who's the barbarians? Okay, so they want us out of there. And the Japanese are very, very fearful that what is going on in China is going to occur to them. Now, what is going on in China is that this is after the first of the Opium Wars. The Chinese will refer to this as the century of humiliation, where they are controlled somewhat by Western powers. So Western powers have basically started to demand concessions from China. They've brought opium into China. They have demanded extraterritoriality, so they're not subject to Chinese laws, and the Chinese are virtually powerless to stop this. And this will go on until basically the 1940s. And so the Chinese always refer to this as the century of humiliation. Well, the Japanese, because they have diplomatic relations with China, they know this is going on. And the Japanese got to do something. And what they're going to try to do is they're going to try to modernize. They're going to try to westernize their economy while maintaining their Asian roots. And they're going to be actually quite successful. We'll see. Well, the clans back, they go against the Tokugawas, and they decide what they're going to do is they're going to look at German Constitution at that time of the 1860s, where we have the Kaiser and then a government. And the decision in Japan is made that how they'll do that is they were going to make the emperor head of state. Not head of government, but head of state. The emperor at this time is a 14-year-old boy. He's never been involved with politics. He's never been involved with anything really to do with the government. He's a religious figure in effect. And he doesn't even really speak Japanese that most Japanese can understand. But he's now head of state. Yes, Avery.
Unlike China, if I'm not mistaken, the United States did not go in and force a drug running regime on Japan.
I would say that's accurate. I think that the Japanese, there just wasn't a lot that we wanted there other than be able to stop off and get coal. Their economy wasn't something that we were really that involved with. So I think that might be part of that as well. Yes.
Did they have coal, or did we have to bring coal in and stockpile?
They have coal, but we would bring it in anyway. That was common. With the little islands we would use, there was no coal there. They bring a collier, and it's very, very difficult, by the way, to put coal on a ship. It's not like you can run a pipeline and pump it full of oil. Okay, you literally bring it in bag by bag. It's a very, very challenging and dirty, by the way, thing to be doing. But anyway, so Meiji is now head of state. 14-year-old boy. He's not head of government. So the way Japanese government works, and this will go on very much this way up until the 1940s. Not 100%, don't get me wrong here, but generally how they run things is this. The government will reach a consensus. Once they reach a consensus, they will then present this to the emperor. The emperor will then sign off on it, generally, particularly at this era, without comment. Meiji would basically just sit there and not speak the entire time. He'd just sit there, they'd lay out their presentation, and he would sign off on it. So we see the thinking really for some of the, and again, don't take this as 100%, but the thinking is some of these is that the emperor doesn't really rule. I don't want you to take that so he's not totally responsible for what goes on in World War II, because that's wrong. But the fact is, that's their thinking. He doesn't really rule the country. He's basically there to approve things. You know, as long as you guys think this is the right thing to do, then that's what we're going to do. And Hirohito later on will take some of that to heart, and we'll see that in future classes. But keep that in mind, that the Japanese government functions this way, that the emperor is head of state, the government is separated pretty much completely. So, all right, so what's going to happen in the Meiji Restoration is we're going to get rid of feudalism immediately. That's the first thing that's going to happen. And what they're going to do is they're going to abolish the domains, the fiefs, in effect, of the Japanese lords, and all land is going to go to the emperor. The emperor is in charge of the entire country. Some clan leaders are going to get jobs as governors. Now, who would those be? Well, you may remember the Battle of Sekigahara, the losers. They were the Shimazu, the Mori, and the Chosokabe, and now they are now all governors. So the Tokugawas have had a bad time right now. So they're out of power, and all the people that they had persecuted, in effect, are no longer there. Now, the samurai, on the other hand, they all lose their jobs. And the emperor proclaims that now every man is a samurai. So you have now an entire class of military folks that are pretty much disenfranchised. This is going to be it's going to be a problem. We'll get there. But Japan institutes mandatory education. Remember, they're trying to get themselves into the Industrial Revolution as quickly as they possibly can. They're going to modernize their state. They're going to look to Britain to modernize their navy, so much so that the Japanese Naval Academy at Etajima, they actually use the same bricks that the British use in their admiralty and design the buildings to look like the British Admiralty. I mean, it goes to that level. They look originally to France to build their army, and then they decide that the German army is a better model, and they begin to model their army on that and buy different weapons. Yes, Marge.
In education for all or not?
I would be surprised at this point. They certainly didn't have universal suffrage. But I don't know the actual answer to that. I would suspicion would be no. But again, I'm not sure. So the samurai class, of course, is abolished, and every man is now a samurai. That's critical. They've started to industrialize, and they're also buying machine tools and other goods from the West as much as they can, because they're trying to get themselves into the late 19th century to protect themselves from becoming China. So the government is trying to consolidate power, and the imperial government starts to issue what's known as imperial rescripts. There is an imperial script for education, and there is an imperial rescript for the military. And these will become extremely important. So, for example, the imperial rescript on education. As children, I'm sure virtually everybody here would get up in the morning and you'd go to school and you'd stand up and you'd face the flag and you'd say the Pledge of Allegiance. The Japanese will do a similar thing. The difference is they will not pledge allegiance just to the nation of Japan. They will pledge allegiance to the emperor. And using something called the Bushido Code, or the Code of the Warrior, is incorporated into their schooling. So they don't pledge allegiance just to America, they pledge allegiance to Japan and to the emperor, and they will defend the emperor, they will die for the emperor as children. Now, when you get to the military, it becomes even a little bit more detailed. So the imperial military rescript, what happens there is every day you line up for roll call, and you're expected to say the imperial rescript word for word. If you should make a tiny error in repeating that rescript, your superior will punch you in the face or hit you with a club. Now, that develops some interesting things as how their military will function. First of all, they're looking to have a military that's absolutely obedient, that they will follow orders. Another pieces of the script is that you will never surrender and you will fight to the death. Well, and you will also take orders that order you to die. Big pieces here. So what Richard B. Frank, the historian, would say is he would refer to this as how the Japanese cult of death starts to be developed. And we see that this is going to have some other problems too, as far as, well, first of all, it makes the Japanese military pretty darn aggressive and pretty darn dangerous, because they literally have soldiers that will accept orders to die. That makes them hard to beat. But there's other problems with this is because they want to have people that are absolutely obedient. That takes away what we would refer to as small unit initiative. They don't want any individual initiative, which is one of the things that makes the German army so incredibly strong in World War II, because their units will change things on the fly and will fight as most efficiently as possible. Japanese units are much, much less likely to do that. Now, another key piece here is because I've been ordered to fight to the death and I will never surrender, and I've been given all this corporal punishment, it tends, in my opinion, to make the Japanese much more likely to treat other people poorly. Remember, they're the Yamato people. They have a god for an emperor. They are special. They are the progenitors of humanity, and they have a right to bring the benevolent rule of the emperor to the 8 corners of the world. So it's best if you don't stand in their way. That's not going to be appreciated. And because they've had all this abuse, the military has abuse, I think this gives them a bigger reason why they see it's more acceptable to begin to abuse people that they see as being their inferiors. And that's a huge problem for the Chinese. That's a huge problem for the Indonesians, especially in World War II. So that's a key piece. When we look at them and they want to achieve these goals, that's going to be something that you've got to look out for. Another thing, of course, is they won't surrender. So if you surrender, well, you're obviously beneath contempt. You shouldn't have surrendered. You know, I wouldn't surrender. So you guys must be inferior to us because you will do that. So that gives them more reasons why they are going to abuse, particularly by World War II. Not so much earlier on, but particularly by World War II, they will feel no reason at all why they shouldn't abuse prisoners, because prisoners are, you know, they shouldn't have surrendered. You know, they're just obviously inferior. So all these pieces are coming from these imperial rescripts that are basically driven into the Japanese people after these are sent out in the late 19th century. Well, let's take a look at the Japanese army at this time. We'll see these imperial officers, and they're all in French-style uniforms. Well, so they're going to, it's in 1873, we're going to have national conscription. Remember, everybody's going to be a samurai. All men are samurai. Everybody is going to be basically drafted if you're physically able or they have the needs for that large an army. and you will be drafted at the age of 21. You will serve 4 years in the military, and then you will be put into the reserve. So the Japanese are going to create a very, very large army very, very quickly. And they are going to arm that with weapons that they're purchasing from the West. And then they're, of course, going to begin to buy machine tools to start making weapons themselves. So they're trying to get into the Industrial Revolution as quick as they can. Well, what has happened is now everybody in Japan has the right to bear arms. This was used to be peasants could not bear arms. So now everybody can bear arms, but you're not allowed to, for example, wear a sword and walk through town with it. I mean, that's what samurai used to do. And if the peasant got in your way, well, you kind of boot them out of your way. But that's gone now. So the symbol of the samurai, they're always carrying a sword. That's taken away from them. So they have been very, very much disenfranchised by this. So they are very, very resentful, and they're in a tough economic position too, because quite honestly, they don't have any skills other than being samurai. So if you're not a samurai anymore, you don't have any way to get an income, you don't really have any skill set. So that's a big problem for the samurai. Now, some of them, of course, will go into the military, but certainly not all of them. And some of them, of course, will serve in government roles as well. But they're not going to be nearly what they were previously. Well, that brings us to this gentleman, Saigo Takamori. And Saigo was actually a leading figure for the Meiji Restoration. He's anti-Tokugawa. That's the best way to put that. So he is there, and he starts to realize that there's all these disenfranchised samurai, and he feels responsible to help them. And so what he's going to do, and again, many of these people are like really in bad shape. They're impoverished from being a knight and having this great position, and now you have nothing. So there are some small stipends that are given to them, but remember, the Japanese government is spending so much money on arming and rebuilding that they really start to lower these stipends almost instantaneously. So these people are the samurai are in a very, very tough position. Well, if you look at Saigo, he's in the middle there, and he's wearing the French style uniform, but he's surrounded by traditionally garbed samurai. And what he's going to do is he's going to start training academies. And he starts his first one in Kagoshima, and then he actually expands this to 132 total across primarily the Satsuma domain, the former Satsuma domain. And they're going to teach these people some academics. They're going to study some Chinese literature, etc. But they're also going to continue to learn how to fight and continue to learn military tactics. Yes, sir.
What time frame are we talking?
Oh, this is going to be early 1870s.
Thank you.
And we'll get there in a second, because what's going to happen next, of course, is you got a bunch of disenfranchised samurai, and they are not particularly happy with their light. They want to regain their status, and there's going to be the Satsuma Rebellion, which will take place in 1877, to answer your question. So 1877, so they want to restore their position. So Saigo and this samurai, they are going to try to have this rebellion. It's crushed from January to September. It's a complete failure. Why is it a failure? Well, the Japanese army, the Meiji army, has gotten incredibly large by this time because of conscription, and also they're much better armed because they've been buying all these weapons from the West. So you got two pieces there, and Takamori is crushed. Now, what he does then is he is going to commit seppuku. I don't like the term harikiri. Harikiri, a rough translation, is belly slitting. I think it's more appropriate to refer to it as seppuku. Seppuku is obviously ritual suicide. So Takamori is going to do that. He's going to die for his feeling, for his cause, in effect. Well, he starts to become a sympathetic figure with Japanese people. They see that he died for his principles. Now, some of where this comes from, I think, is another famous Japanese incident that's referred to as the 47 Ronin. So the 47 Ronin, a Ronin, by the way, is a leaderless, a samurai that doesn't have a lord. And this event happened hundreds of years previously. And these 47 Ronin, they had a master. Their master is basically simplified, he's assassinated. And they are now leaderless. And they decide what they're going to do is they're going to avenge him. And so a year later, they assassinate the lord that had their lord killed, in effect. And they realize that they're going to have to pay the price for this. And they are willing to submit to execution. Because they are willing to submit to execution, the decision is made that they will be allowed to commit seppuku, which is far more honorable. And these 47 Ronin do commit seppuku. This is very famous in Japan. There's plays, they're still making movies about it today. And I think seriously that the Japanese people began to see Saigo Takamori in the same light as they see the 47 Ronin. Well, the emperor in 1889 pardons Saigo Takamori. And this sets, I think, a very, very bad precedent. Because it becomes the thought process in Japan that if you believe morally that your cause is right, that you're doing something that's right for Japan, that this is above and beyond, and you're willing to die to do this cause, that then that cause is better than the law. It is more important to have these high moral principles, these reasons, than it is to obey the law. And the Japanese are going to have a very difficult time with this in the 1920s and 1930s. Yes, sir.
You use the term morally, and you talk about this being a religious, the emperor was a religious leader in effect. But I don't see any underlying religion in any of this. I don't see any kind of ethical or moral values. I don't hear of any philosophers.
Well,
It's
let's
all about a militaristic society built on obedience and fear. And
okay. Well, if you're talking about the emperor, or are you talking about Saigo Takamori? The whole society? Well, that's their religion. Shintoism is vastly different. That's vastly different than Christianity. That's the best way I can describe it. It's vastly different religion. It's a state religion. Many Japanese are not just Shintoists too; they're also Buddhists at the same time. So Shinto is the state religion. Many Japanese can also be Buddhists, and some are Christians. But this is still the state religion. Hopefully that's as clear as I can make it for you.
I don't see this like religion.
But that's how they refer to it as, because it's from the gods, the kami. So that's why it's a religion. Okay. Well, anyway, so the emperor has made this decision to make Takamori, he basically pardons him. Now, Takamori is not allowed to be enshrined in what's known as Yasukuni. Yasukuni, we would see it somewhat like Arlington National Cemetery. Only again, it has a lot more religious basis than Arlington Cemetery ever would have. So to be enshrined at Yasukuni, and we'll have a talk much more about this when we talk about kamikaze. But today, just stay with me on that one, that there was a religious basis to being enshrined at Yasukuni. Okay. Well, so what's going on here? Japan is modernizing at a furious pace, okay? Again, this starts primarily in like 1870, 1868, you could say, and so by 1894, excuse me, by 1894, they've succeeded to modernize quite a bit, and they're not only buying weapons now, but they're also building weapons. But this all comes at a tremendous amount of cost to the Japanese people. The West isn't giving this stuff away. They're not, hey, hey, here's a battleship. No. No, this all costs money, and big money. And the Japanese people are paying outrageous taxes in order to support this society. Yes.
Hey Frank, would you agree that the majority of the Japanese people at this time are peasants? They're basically farmers.
Yes. The question is, the Japanese people primarily peasants, farmers? Yes, they are. And the farmers are paying a big price in taxes to support this development of their country into a modern nation state, an industrialized nation state. So indeed, that's the case. Somebody's paying for all this, and it's primarily the Japanese people. Well, previous to this, like the last time I taught this class, I would have somewhat discounted what I'm going to say next. And it's simply this, that I would have thought that generally the Japanese people were relatively passive in regards to these things. Okay. Since that time, and I don't say this, I would certainly not say this 100%, but I've changed my opinion a bit that the Japanese people, the people that are paying all these taxes, they're starting to drive a more aggressive foreign policy for Japan. Because again, they're oppressed in effect by all these taxes. Their standard of living isn't good. And basically, they want a little something for the effort. And what they're going to want is they're going to start to want colonies, because they see the West has got all these colonies. The West is basically taking chunks of China and doing whatever they want, realistically. And the Chinese people are subjugated. And of course, they're not the Yamato people. So the Japanese feel that they have a right to begin to bring benevolent rule of the emperor to these folks. And what they're going to do is they want, the regular people are starting to drive foreign policy of the Japanese government a bit, not 100%, but towards these goals of colonization. And part of this is because they have been oppressed themselves. They've been forced to do these things, they think, because they have to protect themselves from the West. Well, now they basically want to put some of that hurt in effect on some other people as well. And of course, that's going to be other Asian nations. So what's going to happen is they're going to have a war, the first Sino-Japanese War, 1894-1895. In my opinion, this is the first manifestation of Hakka Ichiyu. So this is the first time that they're going to try to get someone else as part of the 8 corners of the world with the benevolent rule of the emperor. Now, how's that actually work? The thinking, particularly, and this goes into World War II, the Japanese believe that they are going to liberate Asian nations from the white man. They are going to replace that rule with their rule. Okay, now, we look at World War II and we see the behavior of the Japanese people in these various and sundry places. China, Indonesia, Vietnam, and their rule is very, very harsh. And we tend to look at that like the Germans. Okay, we look at like the Germans in Poland and Russia. The Germans are looking for what's called Lebensraum. And Lebensraum, basically, they want to clear the area of non-Aryans so that Aryans can live in these places, only Aryans. So whatever it takes to get rid of those people, they're willing to do it. Japanese, vastly different, even though it looks sort of the same. And what they're thinking is it's based on Confucianism. And the Japanese see themselves as the father of Asian nations. And it's their right as the father of Asian nations to free these other nations from white rule, to create what they refer to in World War II as the co-prosperity sphere. And of course, the issue is that the father must be obeyed. So they're the leaders. You're the children, in effect, and you must obey us. Now, if you decide against being part of this 8 corners of the world, or Hako Ichiyu, as Asians, you are in effect siding with the whites. You're siding against the Japanese and against Asian nations by siding with the whites. That puts you in a position where we can start to see them doing things like what they refer to, what actually Bix refers to them as, using a word called compassionate killing. They don't want to kill you, but unfortunately, because you're not going along with the program, you have to die. So that's a huge issue too. So you'll see their behavior driven by that too. So again, good wars because of the emperor. If the emperor says it's a good war, it's a good war. Yes,
Their treatment of the Chinese, would that be an example of that?
certainly. The 3 alls policy in particular: kill all, burn all, loot all. They're very, very harsh to the Chinese. Well, yes, they are. But regardless, it's a very difficult thing. So what goes on is the Western powers think that the Japanese, little Japan, has no chance whatsoever to do anything in this regard. They're going to easily be defeated by giant China. Well, the Japanese are going to prove them wrong very quickly. As you can see on this map, the Japanese are going to get into Korea, they're going to go into Mongolia, they're going to go along the coast of China and eventually end up by Taiwan. They're going to conquer all this area from the Japanese, from the Chinese, excuse me. So the Qing Empire has really failed to modernize. Again, they're struggling through the century of humiliation. There's been, as we talked about in the Asia Pacific class, that there's been major upheavals in China previous to this war. So they're not in a very good position to defend themselves. And it shows that the Meiji Restoration has been relatively effective. The Japanese have been able to create this new, I would say, Western style, but that's only the industrial aspect of it, because the actual political and the state of the people is actually not Western style at all. It's still very, very much Asian, particularly Japanese Asian. So, but we see that now they've made huge strides in getting themselves into basically what's going to be the 20th century. And that leads us to the Treaty of Shimonoseki. Shimonoseki is a city in Honshu that's basically a gateway between Honshu and Kyushu to get into the inland sea. And so there's going to be this treaty signed at this city. And the first article is that China recognizes definitively and the full and complete independence and autonomy of Korea. That was the reason Japan starts this war, is because they're going to help their good friends, the Koreans, get out of out from under the yoke of Chinese rule. Okay, so they're going to help their buddies, the Koreans. That doesn't particularly work out well for the Koreans, as we'll see, but that was the idea. So Articles 2 and 3, China cedes to Japan in perpetuity and full sovereignty of the Pescadores group. The Pescadores are little islands that separate the Chinese mainland from Taiwan/Formosa. They're also going to take the eastern portion of the Bay of the Liaodong Peninsula, and you can see that up at the top there. They also, like I see in this map, you can see they've captured the Liaodong Peninsula. Down below, they have the Shandong province, so that they now control both sides to get into the part of the Yellow Sea that goes to Tianjin. And of course, that's how the main port that services Beijing. So they've really isolated that whole area. And of course, they're going to move down the coast of China and take Formosa. So they have all that they've achieved. And this really is, the Japanese are thrilled with this. Okay. I mean, this is great. Okay. We're no longer, we have a population issue because the population of Japan has been growing rapidly. Now we have a place for people to go. We have the natural resources of the mainland that's all going to be available to us now. And this is wonderful. And oh, by the way, Korea, it would probably be best if we just helped you by controlling your government. Okay. This might be your best bet because, quite honestly, we're better at it than you would be. So Korea from 1910 until theoretically 1945, depending on which side of Korea you're on, is going to be controlled by the Japanese or by somebody. So we see that everything has really gone really, really well here. Oh man, this is great. Okay. Well, not so much. What's going to happen is the triple intervention. Russia, France, and Germany are going to say, Japan, you're just getting a little too big for your britches. And you know what? We can't have you dominating China. And we want our own pieces going on here. We need to be able to make sure that you don't dominate this area. And if you don't give a bunch of stuff back to China, we're going to go to war with you. Well, the Japanese are a little unhappy about this, of course, and they appeal to the United States and Britain for aid in this regard against these three major Western powers that are basically threatening them. And the United States and Britain, well, particularly Britain, they have no real interest at this time in getting involved with this peace. Because quite honestly, they don't want the Japanese taking their concessions either. So, big piece there. So they said, no, we're not getting involved. And the Japanese, of course, feel very threatened by this. But the Russians, the Germans, and the French have all basically said this, well, we're doing this as a benefit to China. We're here to help them out. Okay. Well, not so much. But what's going to happen is they're going to force the Japanese to give back the Liaodong Peninsula. They're going to force them to give back the area that's across from Taiwan, which is the Fujian province. And it's not like the Japanese aren't going to get anything. They are going to get now a large indemnity from China. Certainly not what they wanted, but they're going to use that indemnity very wisely in the very near future, as you'll see next week. So then on top of it, Russia wants a warm water port, and they lease from the Chinese the Liaodong Peninsula. And of course, they begin to fortify it and build a naval base at Port Arthur. That's a major problem for the Japanese as well, because they're afraid to lose control of the Yellow Sea. So that is really a stick in their eye, if you want to put it that way. And then Germany, France, and Britain, well, we helped you out, China. We got those Japanese to give you back a bunch of stuff, so we need a few more concessions. And indeed, they begin to take more concessions from China. So some historians believe, and I would agree with this somewhat, that this threat of intervention and this problem with has gone on here with these other Western powers, and the fact that then the Western powers take more concessions from China just encourages the Japanese that indeed they need to become an imperial power as well. Because imperial powers must have natural resources and must expand. So I think that's a factor in their behavior as well. And here's a cartoon I really like. This is a French cartoon from that time. And what it's showing is that Queen Victoria, Kaiser Wilhelm II, Tsar Nicholas II, they've all got their knives out. The lady peering over their shoulder is France. We see the Japanese gentleman with his samurai sword out, and they're all carving up China. They're all getting their piece, and of course the Chinese gentleman is yelling for them to stop. They don't. Well, that brings us to World War One. In World War One, Japan will be on the side of what I'll refer to as the Allies, just for simplicity, which is at this time primarily Britain and France. And the reason they're on the side of the Allies at this time is they've signed a really big treaty with the British in 1902. And the Japanese are, this is an advantage for them, to be simply put, because the Japanese Navy occupies German concessions on the mainland of China. Okay, the Germans have no power to stop this. They don't have a big army there. They don't have a navy there to speak of. They have a cruiser squadron that eventually is destroyed by the First Battle of the Falkland Islands as they go all the way across the Pacific, trying to get away from Japan. And Japan has little islands that they take over that are under German possessions. Of course, none of these are fortified or be able to have any defense. So Japan's getting a lot of gains from joining World War One in Asia, and they're going to try to gain even more by taking over parts of China. So Japanese involvement, of course, in World War One in Europe is extremely limited. The British would very much like the Japanese to provide them with some military power. Army would be great. The Japanese army's like, no, we can't be doing that. We don't want it. But you know what we'll do is we'll send some medical units and we'll send a squadron of destroyers to the Mediterranean. Not a lot of support that the Japanese give to the Europe, but what they will do is they will sell them a lot of stuff. And they sell them a lot of material goods, and this brings great prosperity to Japan. And then Japan believes that the British and the US will agree to their ambitions because they're too busy with the Germans. And we'll see that similar situation happen in World War II as well. So that's kind of what they're thinking of doing. But before the US involvement, the Japanese decide they're going to send these 21 demands to China. And the 21 demands are secret. They send this, they don't publicize this, they reach out to the Chinese government, what there is of it, and try to impose these demands in secret. Now, the Chinese government is in disarray at this time. And the reason it's in disarray is simply because the Qing Empire has been overthrown by Sun Yat-sen and the nationalists. He is trying to consolidate power. Unfortunately, there's a problem with that, is because there's all these warlords that have independent armies, private armies, if you will. So in this particular time in history in China is referred to not just the century of humiliation, but the warlord time as well. So the warlords and the nationalist government, there's no real central government in China. So the Japanese are trying, as always, whenever there's a vacuum, somebody's going to try to fill that vacuum. And they're going to try to do that with these 21 demands. Well, the first four groups are kind of moderate. They want recognition of a Manchurian railway. They kind of already have control of that. They want control of Mongolia. That might be a little outrageous. And they want the German ports in China. Well, the German ports in China, they really already have them because they've conquered the Germans that were there. The fifth group is much, much more outrageous in my world. They want control of the Chinese economy. They want Japanese advisors to the Chinese police force. Don't worry, we'll handle the police for you. They want to build 3 major railways in central China, which of course is going to help them control Chinese economy. And guess what? They want that Fujian province back that they lost in 1895. So this is a major demands for the Chinese. Now, remember, I said this was secret. Well, the Chinese basically publish it. And that puts the Japanese in a very, very awkward position with the rest of the Allies. And Britain and the US begin to block these demands, particularly the British at this time. And the Japanese give up on the 5 demands. And the US, this causes a lot of anti-Japanese feeling in the United States, and Britain concludes that it can't trust the Japanese as an ally. Now, remember, they've had a treaty since 1902. Well, Japan goes to They're warring power. They're going to the Treaty of Versailles. And the Japanese want, at this time, we're going to create World War II, the League of Nations, okay, somewhat like the United Nations today. And the Japanese want to put in a racial equality clause into the covenant of the League of Nations. President Woodrow Wilson is not particularly in favor of this. He realizes it's going to be a problem. And what they decide is they're going to make any clause like this has to be a unanimous decision. Well, there's no way the British and the Australians are ever going to agree with this. Of course, the British control India. It's the crown jewel of their empire. And the last thing they want is to give the Indians a racial equality clause. So that is not going to happen. But Japan does get some things. They get the German possessions north of the equator, particularly two islands that will be important to this class, Saipan and Tinian. They will maintain control of the former German holdings in China. The Chinese, of course, object to that, and the Chinese refuse to sign the Treaty of Versailles. They will sign a separate agreement with the Germans later on. And our friend Prince Kanoe, he's at this Treaty of Versailles. He's there as part of the Japanese mission. And he starts to feel that perhaps the Germans are, had a right to be in World War I because they wanted to be a great nation. A great nation has to have natural resources, and the Germans were Johnny-come-latelys to the imperial game, let's put it that way. And so maybe because they were a have-not nation, a great nation that doesn't have enough natural resources, they should have had some legitimate reasons for being in World War I. He also refers to Japan as a have-not nation. This is one of the first times, I think, where we see Japan and Germany coming closer together after the Treaty of Versailles. So that will, of course, be much more apparent in the 1930s. Well, if we look at this map, you can see the dark black horizontal line. That's roughly the equator. The big purple circle is the Mariana and Caroline Islands. The little circle is going to be Truk Atoll, and the circle, big purple circle above that is where Saipan and Tinian are. These are going to be known as the mandates. So they are under control of Japan. Of course, in World War II, this is what we will fight to get across to get closer to Japan, to bring our air power into play as we move across these islands. So where did that come from? It comes from the Treaty of Versailles. And that brings us to the Yellow Peril. And I just really like this picture. We've got this Chinese guy. He's got a pistol. He's got a knife in his teeth. He's holding a torch. He's stepping over the body of a white woman. And I don't know if you can read it, but it says, "The Yellow Terror in all his glop." Now, I'm not sure what glop meant at the time, but I don't think it's complimentary. So there we go. There's the Yellow Peril. And that has a lot to do with Asian relations with the U.S. because the Natural Act of 1790, the first Naturalization Act, says that if you want to, immigrants can be, if you want to be naturalized as an immigrant, you have to be a free white person of good character. So you have to be free, you have to be white, and you have to have good character. Good character somewhat implies at this time Christianity. And the 1870, the amendment is going to be changed a bit to allow for peoples of African nativity. This is post-Civil War, of course, and people of African nativity, they are now allowed to become citizens and to immigrate to the United States. At the same time, though, Chinese that had already been naturalized here lose their naturalization. They take that away. And so basically, they're really excluding Asians at this point. And that brings us to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And what that does is that prohibits all immigration of Chinese laborers. Now, why is this a problem? Well, there's the California gold rush, and there's the building of the Transcontinental Railway. And they needed massive amounts of labor to build those things, to do those jobs. And they've allowed immigration from all these Chinese people to fill that void. Again, it's just as simple as, if there's a vacuum, something's going to fill it. And they bring in all these Chinese. Well, the people in the West are fearful of these Chinese because they think they're taking U.S. jobs primarily. And they don't like them racially either, but the basics of this at this time are more about concerns about jobs. And so these immigrants are not allowed in laborers. Okay. If you're a teacher or a doctor or some major profession, you can come as Chinese. But if you're a laborer, no laborers for 10 years, then it's extended. And then in 1902, it's made permanent that you cannot immigrate from China to the United States for labor. Well, that brings us to a cartoon from 1882. And this cartoon I really like. It shows that this Chinese gentleman can't get in the gates of liberty. He's industrious, he's orderly, he's sober, he's peaceful, and he's not allowed. But you can let in communists, nihilists, socialists, Fenians, hoodlums, I like that, are welcome, but no admittance to these Chinese folks. So even in 1882, there was some pushback about some of these laws. Well, again, it was based on the Chinese. Okay, that was the big problem. Okay, but there's a shortage of labor still. So who's going to fill that shortage of labor is going to be Japanese and Koreans. Well, that creates the Japanese and Korean Exclusion League. This is in San Francisco, and it's established in 1905, these policies. So they want to extend the Chinese Exclusion Act to include Japanese and Koreans. They want, if you are a member of the league, you may not hire any Japanese. They want the Japanese students kicked out of school with white kids. They want segregation of schools. And I think interesting is they want initiation of a propaganda campaign to inform Congress and the president of this menace. Yes, sir.
At the same time, the southeastern United States was sending a ton of missionaries to China and had a lot of relief work into China.
Yes.
It's like you had two separate things. You had the West Coast actions, and then you had the rest of the country.
I would say that's somewhat accurate because the people in the eastern coast had no Chinese or Japanese living there. I can't tell you the answer for sure, but I think that might be a factor. And they're not threatening their jobs. So they're not there. So anyway, they want to warn about that menace. Okay. So then in 1906, the school board in California, San Francisco particularly, bans all Japanese kids from going to school with whites. There's going to be segregation of school. The Japanese are very angry about this. The government demands, and I'll read that, to preserve the image of Japanese people in the eyes of the world, we must rescind this. Well, Theodore Roosevelt, who's president at the time, has a relatively favorable opinion of Japanese, and he agrees to something known as the Gentleman's Agreement. This is not official policy. But what he says is this, is we'll get your kids back in school, but you will issue no passports for people to immigrate to the United States. And that is the basis of the Gentleman's Agreement. Now, does that really hold? It's not official. And there's a lot of loopholes. But what does happen is Japanese can still go to Hawaii. They will stay in Hawaii for a couple of years, and then they can immigrate to the United States. Now, I find it kind of fun to think about in a sense. All right, so that's why there's all these Japanese that live in Hawaii during World War II.
Yeah.
And what happens, of course, is General Short, who's in charge of defense of the Hawaiian Islands and at Pearl Harbor, he is afraid of these Japanese immigrants sabotaging our aircraft. So he lines all our aircraft up where they can be easily defended from sabotage. Of course, when the Japanese Naval Air Force comes to bomb Pearl Harbor, they're all out in the open and they're easily destroyed. So when it's just simple enough that when we look at what actually occurred there, that in a sense, these Japanese immigrants did help destroy our Air Force. So kind of fun, I thought. Anyway, that brings us to the Immigration Act of 1924, and that's going to outright ban the immigration of Arabs and Asians. Okay, so if you're an Arab or Asian, you can't come to this country at all. And the reason is you can't become a citizen. So if you can't become a citizen, you may not move to the United States. And this is straight out eugenics. They mean it directly. It says, quite honestly, by the historian of the state office, says this is to preserve the ideal of American homogeneity. These people cannot be part of our gene pool, in effect. And the law provided that no alien ineligible, like I said, could become a citizen. So you can't, if you can't become a citizen, you can't come here. So if you're Arab or Asian, you're not getting in. And this act is not repealed until 1952. It is
Wow.
65, and there are some exceptions made for Chinese and Muslims in 1944. The reasons there's exceptions made in 44 is because the Chinese, for example, are our ally. And this doesn't really sit well with anybody at this time. And we said, okay, we'll allow some Chinese immigration. The total number of immigrants allowed in 1944 is, anybody have an idea? 100.
Oh. That's funny.
It's a token at best. So Valentine S. McClatchy, he's a leader of this anti-Japanese movement. He says they come here specifically and professedly for the purpose of colonizing and establishing here permanently the proud Yamato race. And by the way, they're Asians, so they'll never fit in. They can't possibly assimilate. Japanese are furious. This is just another slap in the face. And their ambassador to the U.S., Hanihara, he writes to our Secretary of State, Charles Evan Hughes. He goes, the manifest objective of the section barring Japanese immigrants is to single out Japanese as a nation, stigmatizing them as unworthy and undesirable in the eyes of the American people. So the Yamato people can't become citizens, they can't immigrate here, and they are very, very unhappy. And all these things will contribute to friction between the United States and Japan, of course, leading eventually to World War II. And with that, what I would like to say is if you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer them, or we will see you all next week. Yes.
These laws are not common in other Western European countries because there wasn't the same amount of work.
That's basically the issue. Yeah, there's jobs available. Now, this is also aimed against Eastern Europeans, for example, are radically eliminated from coming in. Jews are not welcome here by this 1924 law. This 1924 law is more about Eastern Europeans and Jews than it is actually about Asians.
But you don't see this happening in other Western, like Britain and Germany.
I would imagine there are, but I would imagine there. If you were part of the empire, which Japan would not have been, but for example, if you were Indian, you could immigrate to England. Yes, Avery.
Simply recall that I read the Churchill book recently. Once the Great Depression hit, Great Britain basically eliminated immigration from Eastern Europe,
Yes.
including Jews.
Yeah.
And so in terms of time period, you advance it 5 years. And most of Western Europe was doing the same thing.
Well, these laws were in the United States were welcomed by the AFL. the American Federation of Labor was all in favor of this because they were afraid of losing American jobs. Even though the president, I believe, of the AFL was at the time Jewish. So, but he was more concerned about, keeping Jews out of here as much as possible, which is an effect too. Yes, sir, Bill.
Why would the Arabs exclude?
They're not white. They're not Christians.
Well, that's where we get Africans too, then, I don't know. But.
Well, we had slaves we made citizens, so they basically, it just follows that they're going to make African people of African nativity, black nativity, let's be honest, available to become citizens, okay? But somehow Arabs didn't qualify.
Was that Arabs or Muslims?
Both. Yes, sir.
Back to the earlier discussion about, an act carried out for moral purposes could be considered superior to the law.
Yes.
This implies, of course, that there was law in the country, which would also mean probably the national government, regional government, the police, and a constitution somewhere. With all that in place,
In Japan, yes, absolutely. They had a constitution as of the 1860. It was modeled after the 1860 German Constitution. Let's make this very simple. The question about were there what constituted laws and we're going to talk about the proper term for what we're discussing here is Gekko Kujo. And we'll talk a great deal about Gekko Kujo 2 weeks from now. And because it's so critical to what goes on in the 20s and the 30s in Japan. So we'll talk about that in much greater detail. I kind of glossed over it because I'm going to talk about it. But the fact is that there were laws, of course, in Japan. If you murder somebody, you murdered them. Okay, so there's certainly, and there was a constitution in Japan, as like I said, after the 1860s model from Germany. So certainly there were laws, but somehow laws after the emperor pardoned Takamori, they became less important. It was more important to have these, what they feel were moral principles of doing what's right for the country. That makes it simpler, I think. But we'll talk about Gekko Kujo and so much more. So I guess that's it for today. So thank you all for coming and hope to see you all next week where we'll talk about Russia and Japan from the 1890s until 1940. So thank you for coming.
thank you.
I have no idea what time it is.